Good morning, everybody, and good day to everybody who's online following us, wherever you may be. Gilberto, thanks for a very rich introduction covering a lot of the issues that I hope to also touch upon. The focus I want to have today is more about food security and talk a little bit about it as a global picture. And I'm going to use global maps, but I'm not stupid enough to zoom in and look at the details where I know they often don't capture the richness that we need. So it was a very good example, I think, of Gilberto to show what the danger you can have by looking just because a map is global at 10 meters. Doesn't mean that every 10 meters is going to be an extremely accurate representation of reality. But I will use them a lot because I think they're a useful big picture. And as part of food security, just looking through our landscapes, passing through them, traveling through them, seeing agriculture and food everywhere, and looking like a very diverse system with a lot of variability, both in what we cultivate and what we eat. But I think one of the messages I have today is some of that diversity is actually being lost at quite a rapid rate. And that diversity is incredibly important for enabling us to have a sustainable future in our production systems. So one of the questions I thought about was, how did we get here? How did we end up with all of these different agricultural systems and all of the challenges that we face in our agricultural production and the impact that has on the environment, on the climate, on people and society? So what I'm going to try and do is do a really brief history of agriculture in one slide. I'm going to go all the way back to 200,000 years ago, when everyone was hunter-gatherer. Some people say this was probably the peak of human civilization. We were the fittest, healthiest, and happiest we'd ever been. And that continued for a long time until we first domesticated cattle, about 12,000 years ago, the first agricultural revolution. So instead of following the animals around, we started to pen them up. And then we started to settle in one place. A few millennia after that, some of the first crops like wheat and lentils were cultivated. So these settlements not only had cattle, but they also started to identify wild grains and seeds. And I see, this particular plant's doing very well. Maybe I'll save the seeds of that and plant it again next year. So that it was also the first time people had kind of selective breeding and really observing nature and seeing what they could benefit from nature. And what's really interesting here is when these crops like wheat and lentils were first cultivated, we're not really sure. Was wheat first cultivated for bread, or was it first cultivated for beer? My bet's on the beer. But it's really interesting to look at the archaeological record and trying to understand what was it that drove people to first cultivate these crops. Intensification of agriculture happened about 5,000 years ago. As settlements and cities grew, the realization was you had to provide sufficient food for these settlements and cities. And this is why most of our cities are where they are. They're in areas that are incredibly productive, rich soils, or they're in areas where food could be transported easily to the cities, by rivers, for example. This continued and continued for thousands of years until we started to mechanize agriculture. Until that point, most of our agricultural work had been incredibly difficult labor. A lot of human effort required to produce the food we needed. Mechanization started about 300 years ago. 100 years ago, we discovered the Haber-Bosch process. This was the basis for nitrogen fertilizer, artificial fertilizer. This led to an incredible increase in production. But the Green Revolution about 70 years ago was the realization with the increasing population, we still were not able to meet the demands of that population. So we had to produce more food than ever before. The Green Revolution enabled that by 3 technologies: producing higher yielding varieties, increase in irrigation, and a massive increase in fertilizer. Now, those 3 things were very important to meet food production needs at the time. But the way it's been adopted and the way it's exploded and dominated our agricultural system also has a lot of serious impacts, which lead to some of the tensions we see between biodiversity and food production. And now what's going on, we have a lot of things. We have gene editing, our ability to look right down at the genetic level at plants and adjust them to meet particular needs, to make them more resistant to pests and diseases, to increase their nutritional content, to make them drought resistant. We're looking at alternative sources of protein. Do they come from insects? Do they come from lab-generated meat? Rediscovering or reinventing agroecological practices, organic farming, regenerative agriculture, being more in balance with nature. So how can we find ways of farming and producing food that have less impact on the environment? Biofuels, we don't just feed ourselves, we feed our engines, we feed our planes, we feed our cars, and that's a big question of whether that actually makes sense. Farming is heavily subsidized. There's a huge economic component of the way we produce food. And now precision agriculture. Maybe a digital revolution is on the way. And how do you get more information technology into farming systems, helping to be more sustainable, to better understand how to more effectively use resources? And over that time, that increase in food production allowed us to see this kind of growth that we have in the world's population over the last 10,000 years. It's the basic, typical hockey stick. Here, and I've put ITC, 1950, when we had 2.5 billion people on the planet. Now it's close to 8 billion. So a lot of things have changed during the lifetime of ITC. We've been incredibly successful in producing more and more food. The number of kilocalories per person on a global level has improved substantially. At the same time, we've had to produce much more energy to meet the growing demands of a changing society. And fertilizer production has a big part of this. Fertilizer production is an incredibly energy-intensive process. And again, you can see how things have changed since ITC was established. And the same goes for extraction and use of fresh water. Huge changes over time. Now, it makes it look like ITC is the source for all of this, but it's not the case. But just to give you a perspective of how things have dramatically changed during this 70-year period. And it has been some of the most dramatic changes in our entire history of agricultural production. Despite all of those advances, despite all the changes, hunger and malnutrition are still pervasive. In the 1960s, this map is showing the average number of kilocalories available per person, per capita. And countries in the yellow are where there was a substantial deficit in the available calories. Moving forward, the picture is now much better. So this is about 10 years ago, or 2013. You can see most of the countries have moved up into the blue scale. Great progress. However, looking again at a time series, we see that while we've been very successful in reducing the number of undernourished people, it's flatlined in the last decade or so. And because of things like COVID, for example, which had a huge impact on our ability to produce food and actually deliver food, we're starting to see an increase in the number of people who are undernourished. The result is that 1 in 10 people is undernourished and 1 in 4 on the other side of the equation is overweight. There's also the question of inequality in how food is made available to people. One of the global maps. 50% of our habitable land is now used for agriculture. It is the biggest transformation of our land, by far. 51 million square kilometers. 77% at best estimate is used for livestock and dairy, and about 23% of it is used to grow crops. And as Gilberto mentioned, forest loss, most of it is attributed to agricultural expansion. What I find interesting is that if you go into a supermarket, and if you compare it perhaps to one that you saw 20, 30 years ago, you see much more diversity, you think, in the market. And, oh, look at all the products I can get from around the world. It's incredible richness that we perceive as there. But if you go to a market in another country, you start to see, well, all these markets are now looking the same. The same food is available everywhere. So do we really have more diversity? Or is it just an illusion? How diverse are the crops we grow? How diverse are our farming practices? How diverse are our agricultural landscapes, actually? We see because of monocultural practices and the reliance on a very small number of particular products, that this diversity is actually decreasing. And yet we know this diversity is essential for sustainable food production. And this graphic is just giving you a representation of all the incredible diversity that's out there. And this is just one type of crop, peppers and chilies, a subsample of 12,000 that are out there that we know of. And each of these cultivars has evolved to exist and succeed in a particular niche environment. And we are losing that diversity because of the rapid changes we are seeing and the loss of diversity in our natural systems. But we know we have to maintain this. And if you're interested in these kind of graphics, Uli Westerpal has got an amazing set of these kind of crop pictures that really express clearly how diverse our food systems can be and how important it is that we don't lose them. We also know we have increasing impacts of climate on food. as we see what sounds like a relatively small change in the global average temperature of 1, 1.5, and 2 degrees, what you see is actually a big change in those extremes, the end of the distribution. The amount of land, the amount of area, the amount of people who might be affected by these extremes is increasing substantially. The result are situations like this. And overall, the impact of climate is negative. There are cases where there are benefits to a warming climate. Certain areas will see more favorable situations, but overall it's negative and it's very unequally distributed. And these are some of the impacts we see. Shifting on certain seasons, more variation in rainfall patterns, more frequent extreme droughts, the exposure of not just the crops and the animals to extreme heat, but to farm workers, putting them in extremely dangerous positions because of the exposure to heat and the way they have to work. At the same time, we know that food systems have an impact on climate. And this is just showing where all the greenhouse gas sources are coming from. And food and agricultural land use is about 1/4 of that. It's a big percentage of the greenhouse gas sources. And we know the emissions have increased over the last 20 years, driven by this rapid growth. To take another perspective, this is a map I like to show because it translates a lot of things into something that we can all understand. It's money. It's showing the value of crop production on a scale of $1 per hectare up to 10,000 plus per hectare. So those bright yellow areas is where the majority of our food is produced and the value that food has when it's in the ground. Of course, that food doesn't just exist in the ground. It has to be harvested, it has to be transported, it has to be packaged, it has to be processed, and all of that adds value to it. So what is the true cost of our food? The global cost of food is about $9 trillion by the time it gets to you on your plate. Trillion is a big number. I have a difficult time visualizing that. A million seconds, I always like to say that time is money. A million seconds is 11 days. A trillion seconds is 32,000 years. The GDP of the Netherlands is less than 1 trillion, and the Netherlands is a very rich country. But what's the true cost? There are a lot of hidden costs that we don't account for in our food. There are environmental costs, estimated at between another 4 and 11 trillion that we don't account for. The cost to human life, health, so 3.3 to 39 trillion. The impacts on health due to our dietary choices, for example. And the economic costs, another 2 to 1.7 trillion. Big numbers. So basically our food's about a third cheaper than if we accounted for the true price of food. These are the choices and decisions we've made in the way we produce food. So agriculture is really big. Uses half the Earth's habitable land, produces more food than ever before. It's an extremely successful system, but has major negative consequences, and we need to get the balance back. It supports the livelihoods of millions of people, makes a huge contribution to our economies, and it produces goods worth trillions of euros or dollars every year. Our food systems, however, are starting to really threaten our natural resources to the point where maybe it's a risk that we cannot recover certain things. They're lost forever. Many people are still food insecure, and there are real concerns about the abilities of our food systems to meet future food demands in a sustainable way. So now I want to talk a little bit about food security and food systems and translate that into the kind of work that ITC has been doing to solve some of these problems. So agricultural produce, it's used for fiber, it's used for our medicines, it's used for biofuel, bioplastics, but most of it is used for our own consumption. And as part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we have goal number 2 for zero hunger. End hunger, achieve food security, improve nutrition, and promote sustainable agriculture. There is then the question about what is food security? And the definition is complex. It's changed over the years. The Green Revolution was the time when we first talked about we need to increase production. And after that, we talked about, well, we need to make sure that production is affordable and accessible. And then we talked about, well, that also needs to be the things that we want to eat. There are cultural preferences. I want to have nutritious food that meets my needs to have a healthy and play a role in the economy. So the food security definition has increased and become more complicated, and it covers all of these different dimensions. Food security exists when all people at all times have physical, economic access to sufficient and nutritious food. It meets their dietary needs and their food preferences for an active and healthy life. There's quite a lot to unpack there, so I'm going to break that down into these different dimensions. The first one is food availability, producing enough food, storing enough food, making sure we have stocks. Then making sure that it's accessible by physical transport and economic. Can I afford it? Is it within reach? Is it the food I want to eat? Does it meet my needs, dietary, nutritious, and culturally? And doing that season after season, year after year, day after day, making sure that this stability is ensured. Because if any of these is not met, then we have a food security problem. We know food security affects and is affected by many things. It requires a lot of land resources, but the way in which we expand that agricultural production impacts biodiversity. Population growth and urbanization have led to increasing demands not just in the quantity of food, but the type of food that we eat. Economic growth, again, similar trends. However, we know that access to land and technology is not equal. Climate change, hazards and disasters, and pests and disease, like this example showing locusts in East Africa. It's complicated. It's big science and big questions needed to address these issues. And some of the challenges I see particularly are climate change, where we're going to see increased price shocks due to the impact of more frequent extreme weather. Some of you may be coffee lovers. I don't know if you've been paying attention to what's been happening in Brazil, with some of the drought that's affecting coffee production. Buy your coffee now. Abandonment of land that's becoming non-productive, unprofitable, may happen in future. Rapid urbanization rates in Africa and Asia. It means increased demand for affordable food and the infrastructure to deliver it there. Increased concentrations of people means we also have to think about the transportation infrastructure to support that. Increased income due to poverty reduction, economic growth, which means increased demand for meat and dairy products at a scale which is simply not sustainable in the way that we produce this food. Increased consumption of highly processed and micronutrient-poor foods. And this malnutrition has knock-on effects in health. That incredibly scary 3 to 39 trillion cost on health of the way we produce and consume food. And food safety. Food just doesn't go from A to B anymore. It goes from A to B via C, D, E, F, and G. And how do we trace and monitor these complex food chains in future? So food security exists within this bigger food system. We talk about the science and the technology where we try to have an impact on the farming system, knowing that there are other issues here like the land and climate change that we need to be aware of. And these are all connected to one another. There are feedback loops and there are impacts. But it's actually a much more complicated picture than that. And somebody who was much braver than me tried to put this all in one diagram. And I think they've done a really good job in just representing how complex the food system is and how it connects to so many different things. And I'm just going to highlight a few things here. Like food security, of course, is within this. And from an ITC perspective, you see that there are various entry points for science and technology to look at this food system and understand what's going on and all the connections between them. Education and training all the way through the chain is a very important part of how we can understand and get people engaged in different parts of the food system. Underpinned by the environment, the reliance on water resources, economic growth. How resilient is this system to shocks? Can it absorb them? Can it change? Can it adapt? Climate change, energy, population, health, governance, politics, and trade. And what I find interesting, and that's where I want to go into the next part of the talk, is how ITC is working with partners in just about all these different aspects and how they all connect to the food system. And making them more sustainable, making them healthier, making them more equitable and resilient means addressing all of this complexity. So that's what I'd like to talk about now in the last part of the lecture. What's ITC's role in making this transformation? And transformation is the key word. Our agricultural systems have been changing since 12,000 years ago. But now the need to transform more rapidly and in a more coherent way is just becomes so essential if we're to overcome some of these challenges. Before I go into what ITC is doing, I think it's important to recognize what has happened in the past. What has been ITC's roles? And I'm going to take a very brief snapshot here. And I think for a complete history, you have to talk to people like Homer Martinez and Yorin Telau. But here are some selected snapshots of what's been going on. 80s and 90s, We had survey integration courses chaired by Prof. Henk Lunning, land use planning, Professor E.S. Sonneveld, landscape ecology. Ton Kannington launched the sustainable agricultural coursework within rural land ecology. I hope you recognize some of these names in the audience. 1990s, we had Ton supported by Herman Housing, wrote the basic reader on agroecology. Suzanne Grote started work with FAO on Artemis, which is the Africa Real-Time Environment Monitoring Information System. Eyeballing some of these printed maps to understand what was going on, really monitoring real time for the first time. Prof. Herman Kolen, appointed by Klaas-Jan Beek, focused on crop growth simulation techniques. Kees Bronsveld, Kees de Bie, joining ITC at that time. And within the rural landscape ecology, we had sustainable agriculture, gradually getting structured into the program. And I said, this is a snapshot. I want to spend some time looking back, but I appreciate there's an awful lot more here behind this. Mid-1990s, Paul Driesen replaced Herman van Kolen, Professor of Sustainable Agriculture. There was a Sustainable Land Management Conference organized by Klaas-Jan Beek. And the launch of a cross-developmental research group called FoodSat at ITC. And this poster is capturing a bit of that FoodSat philosophy. Professor Evik Smaling, Professor of Sustainable Agriculture in the 2000s. The People, Planet, Profit theme emerged then. And in the 2000s, we appointed a professor in spatial agriculture and food security. I've mentioned a few key names, but of course there's a huge number of people behind you. MSc students, PhD students, staff working in the lab, in the field. An incredible richness of work, and I'm happy for the next few slides, and thanks to my colleagues who've allowed me to use some of their work to show you how diverse this is. I want to put this in the perspective of what are the priorities for improving these food systems. There's an excellent paper that came out in Nature a few months ago, just before the United Nations Food Summit, which was the first United Nations summit on this topic. What are the 7 priorities to end hunger and protect the planet? Number 1, make nutritious food more available and accessible. Number 2, reduce the risks to our production systems. 3, increase the resilience of our food networks. Protect and secure the land rights of people. Reduce the losses and the waste that we currently have in our food systems. Manage and protect the natural resources, which are essential for our food production systems. And increase access to digital technology. I'm not going to talk about all of these because it's a long list, but I'm going to pick out a few examples and show some of the contributions of ITC and partners. And also make some links to some of the other themes that we see at ITC. These, as I wanted to show from that incredibly complicated diagram, food security doesn't exist in isolation. It links to health, it links to risk and resilience, it links to governance and planning. It's incredibly important to understand water, energy, and land resources. And how do we use geoscience and technology to look at all of those things? And I think this is something that Gilberto explained very well. The potential we have to look at it, but making sure we get the balance right between using the technology and understanding what it is that we're observing. So let's take a look at some examples. I'm going to use one to start with when it comes to looking at nutrition. This is the High Nutri project. Mariana Belgi and Michael Marshall, colleagues in CNR in Italy, supported by the European Space Agency. And this project is interesting because it's not just looking at the quantity of food that we produce through remote sensing, it's also looking at the quality. So we're using Earth observation image data as an alternative to estimate nutrient composition, and using some of the new available hyperspectral imagery that's been made available in Europe to look at, can we understand leaf canopy absorption and reflectance and how they relate to certain aspects of the nutritional content of the plant. And as I said, this is about quality and quantity. And what's fascinating is that you can get a sense from this hyperspectral remote imagery. What is the nitrogen content of the plant? What is the iron content? What about magnesium, calcium, looking at in the grain? So the grain that you actually consume, what is the micronutrient content? What is the value for you from a nutritious point of view? And this becomes particularly interesting because even though we have a very complicated transport network that moves food all around the world, an awful lot of food is still consumed locally. It's produced there and it's consumed there. So if you know more about the nutritional availability of food in a particular area, you can say something on a bigger scale about the nutritional availability for the population as a whole. The second aspect is looking at de-risking the food systems. How do you reduce risk? One of the ways we've been looking at that with partners is livestock insurance. Many of the livelihoods in these pastoral systems depend on livestock, where drought is the biggest risk that they face to production. Using the NDVI time series, you can start to understand and monitor anomalies. How does the pasture look this year compared to last year? How much forage availability is it for these cattle? Producing these with various spatial and temporal aggregations and analysis, you can come up with an anomaly map to show where is there an issue this year in the availability of forage and what would be the likely impact of that on pastoralist livelihoods. And these satellite images are used to trigger payouts to these farmers. Initially in Kenya as a government program, now expanded far beyond that. Looking on the other aspect, not just for food for animals, but food for people, we can look at the Vegetation Index Crop Insurance Program. Funded by Netherlands Space Office, European Commission, this is work by Case2B, and trying to solve this problem of how do you get enough data into the financial models for actuaries to make really robust assessments of what is the risk. How can I confidently give a payout to someone knowing that a drought has occurred? And again, looking at the extremes in the distribution of NDVI, the extreme lows which dictates or tells us when a drought has occurred, and delivering this data through the GeoNetcast system, and doing this time and time and again so that you can produce maps every season, every year, that show the impact. What was the drought in a particular pixel, and therefore what would be the payout for any farmers that were insured under that system. And this system is really robust in the sense that it doesn't pay out against lost yield, it pays out against the credit that a farmer is encouraged to take at the beginning of the season. So it's encouraging farmers to invest in their land, invest in their crop, to boost their productivity, and ensuring that financial investment. As food goes from A to B via C, D, E, and F, we also realize that we need to increase the resilience of these food networks. So working with the faculty on campus, the ET faculty and FAO, we analyzed the transport network's ability to transport sufficient food to meet demands and to look at the resilience to do so under different shocks. And by working with FAO, we were able to do this not just for one country, but for 90 countries around the world. I'm just going to take an example of the sort of things that we were looking at, taking cassava in Nigeria, produced in all these areas, but looking at where the consumption and demand is. And you see that the spatial pattern between the two is quite different. So food has to move between these different areas to meet demand. But how does it move? What happens if there's a flood? What happens if this bridge or road is damaged? What would be the impact of the ability of the network to provide that food? How resilient is it? What are your other options? How can you get there through another route? And we started to look at this for all these countries and find out these bottlenecks, these critical points in the network that if there were some damage or loss to these systems, then we would have a big impact on the ability of this network to provide food to people. And we were able to do that for all of these 90 countries, where the color coding here tells us whether there was an alternative route available. So if you're in dark blue, you've got lots of alternatives in your ability to move food from A to B. So it's resilient in that perspective. You can get food there through an alternative route. Those countries where the color coding is quite a different color, we see that there are very few abilities. Any damage to the food system in these critical areas can have a major impact on the ability to move food around. The other aspect is documenting land tenure rights. So who owns the land? And how does that have an impact on the way that they use the land and the way they invest in the land? Because if we want to increase production, we want people to manage the land and be confident that the land will be theirs for a long time, so their investment is worthwhile. We know that insecurity of land tenure is a prevalent problem. If you don't invest, productivity will not increase. Documenting these land rights, then, is something that we really need to increase the security. And we know that progress on this is slow, and it's actually a key indicator in the Sustainable Development Goals, increasing land tenure. So we need some innovative approaches to transform and speed up this process. There are different ways of doing this through capacity development, and here giving a few examples provided by Jaap Zevenberg and Milakova, OKP project, Zambia, school land administration studies. But really the use of geospatial technologies to increase the speed at which we can secure these rights. and looking at different ways of doing feature extraction from high-resolution imagery, the use of UAVs, the smart schema approach. And I think it's nice to note here that these images provided by Milakova were recognized in the Geospatial World Forum early this week and receiving the Innovation Award for these innovative geospatial tools in land rights mapping. A similar effort relates to the Colombian peace agreement. And as a result of the peace agreement that took place in Colombia, the government needs to secure and provide tenure security to many more people. But the task they face is enormous. There are 16 million parcels, but only 6% of them are up to date in this system. The rest is either outdated or was never registered. So how are you going to go about meeting that tenure security commitment in the peace agreement? Now, the traditional approach of doing this, a field survey, would take them hundreds of years to actually achieve this. And the cost per land parcel is estimated at like $100. And you think about the time required and the cost required to do this, it's just not feasible. So how do you transform and change that system? The Dutch government offered help. So with the lead of Cadastre and ITC and support from Esri, created a method to do this, looking at the large number of parcels efficiently and effectively with a kind of community-based approach as well. So they were really involved in the data collection themselves. So it's a kind of fit-for-purpose approach where you have survey on aerial imagery, cloud-based data storage, discussions driven by community-based reconciliation between neighbors, and hopefully in the end, the title being handed over at a much faster pace on a much larger scale. With this process, you can do many villages in a few weeks rather than taking years. The result, land titles, happy stakeholders, security of tenure, and a very happy Prime Minister Mark Rutte joining the photograph opportunity in this case. The other area where things need to change is to reduce losses. There are some really quite worrying numbers globally. About 30% of our food production is lost in the field due to pests and diseases. It doesn't even get off the field. A further 30% is lost in waste in transport, in the house or between the farm and the fork. So what can we do with our remote sensing and geospatial technology? Well, we can start to look at some of the causes. What are some of the causes in the field? One of them is called crop lodging, where grain crops, typically standing vertically, will lodge over, either due to having too much nutrients, they've grown too tall too quickly and they become too weak and they fall over, or it can also be caused due to wind and rain, but even the genetic characteristics of the crop. So here we can use some of the remote sensing technology to really understand where lodging is occurring, because we didn't really know the scale of the problem, and then try to see the susceptibility of different crops in different environmental conditions, and get an understanding of where it may be likely to happen and what interventions could you have in time to do something about it. A second challenge is the pests and pathogens and diseases. We can never eradicate these completely. They will always be part of our food systems. But what we can do is have early warning systems to tell us where are we likely to see the next problem. We can have systems which look at a particular pathogen, here the rust pathogen affecting wheat in East Africa, and start to develop these kind of spatial models that really tell us something about what's the likelihood of this pathogen surviving in the off-season and then being ready to invade the crop in the new season. So then what are you going to do about it on a kind of strategic point of view to manage this pest? The other part I mentioned was the loss that occurs between the farm and the fork. And here, work by Valentine Venus showing how we can use a combination of crowdsourced imagery to look at how long it takes food to get from A to B across a road of a particular quality under environmental conditions where we understand the temperature and humidity. So how does that affect the choices people make and where to transport their food to market? If they have to transport foods like tomatoes over a long distance in an unrefrigerated truck in high temperature, they know that that food quality is going to reduce dramatically during that journey. So may they take other options when they understand the conditions that are there. I think one project I'd like to mention is the Ethiopian Education Network to support agricultural transformation, short name NSAT. What this is trying to do from a food security perspective, linking to agricultural transformation policies, is to strengthen geographic information and earth observation education programs in 3 universities in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, Bahidar, and Mekelle. It does this by developing a coherent applied research program working with 9 PhD students from those 3 universities who are here collaborating with ITC and partners, and 18 MSCs supporting them. And all of these topics are aligned with these universities' regional mandates to make an impact, all across different aspects of food security, looking at nutrition, looking at irrigation, looking at land resources, looking at ecosystem services, looking at Internet of Things to get sensor networks to inform us more about agricultural production, and collaborating with vocational training centers, so aligning courses with labor market needs. Each of those universities is really embedded in a network of training. So those are all examples of what ITC and partners have been doing and still continue to do, and how relevant they are to different parts of looking at the food system. But I do have a few questions about where are we going next. So I had a few thoughts about ITC's future role. And Gilberto introduced this incredibly well, so I don't want to say very much about it, but we do need education, research, and partnerships to exploit this incredible richness of data that we have, monitoring the where, the when, and the how of production, for example. The transformation that we've seen in our ability to exploit this data is really exciting. But that transformation, looking at the complicated diagram of food systems, requires actionable digital information, so things that really are trying to address someone's particular information needs. And that means collaboration, talking with the stakeholders, being engaged, working in partnerships. Better understand the flow of food from A to B. As these chains become more complicated, we need to start and understand the teleconnections, the drivers, the impacts, and the value chains. So how do we quantify these faraway drivers? How do we track the flow of food, rather than using a place-based mentality? I'm glad you mentioned deep learning. Get the balance right between what I've called deep learning and deeper learning. The models we use, the systems we have, we really need to understand the processes, what's going on. Students need to understand those processes. Don't lose the richness of the models and the understanding. We've been observing nature since people first started selecting a particular plant to grow. We have to keep that observation and understanding of nature in our information technology approaches. Education must emphasize system thinking. It doesn't exist in isolation. We need to understand those connections. And finally, as I showed many photos of students in the field maintaining that presence, that physical presence in the field. That field work and stakeholder involvement, working with our partners in the field, really helps us to make sense of what we see in the sensors. We can never lose that. As much information as we have available to us through our various sensor networks, this is going to remain an essential part of the way we do business in the future. For me, this is a very positive slide, because if I look at what ITC is doing and our partners are doing, we've got this. In many ways, we are actively working in this kind of way. I think it's just a plea to say, let's not lose it, and let's build on it. It's a long list of people who thankfully gave me some of the wonderful examples I could share with you today, and it's only a snapshot of what's going on. There's much more richness in there in what's being done with our partners, with our students, with our staff and our colleagues. So I'd like to acknowledge and thank them here for all the contributions they gave today. Thank you very much.